Tanking. Tanking is fun. You get to be the center of the boss's attention. The boss looks at you. You look like a badass. You lead the group and everyone loves you. So you want to get in on that glory? Great.
But I don't know anything about tanking.
I hear you mutter.
I'm afraid I'll mess up and people will hate me.
I hear you cry out in pain. Well then, Sunshine Dust, this here guide's for you. A quick disclaimer before we begin. This guide is created to display the most basic level of tanking required to clear all regular content competently. This means dungeons, normal trials, normal 8-person raids, and the 24-person raids. This is just stuff all tanks should know and be doing just so that their DPS and healers don't silently despise them. As for having what's commonly called tank anxiety, I'll just let my good friend ShB tell you to
do it! Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams.
So without further delay, let's begin. The HUD. Yes, we're starting here. I'd highly advise splitting up the target bar element and moving the target info bar so it's a bit more obvious. This is where all the target's casts are being displayed, and since you'll always be targeting the boss, it'll display upcoming tank busters and AoEs. Maybe even make this element larger if it helps make it more obvious for yourself. Knowing when the boss is casting what will help you greatly once you learn what name is a tank buster and what name is an AoE. Do note that not all casts in the game are displayed here, but for the vast majority of normal content, this will let you know when what's coming. Enmity. So let's quickly go over how to track enmity. Let's look at the party list. You'll see this red line, a yellow line, and a bunch of white lines, along with numbers associated with each. This is enmity levels. The red one is always the tank. If it's not the tank, some poor DPS is currently being spanked by the boss. The yellow one is the next in the enmity list. This should be the off tank, or will be the healer or most badass DPS in the party. And then there's just everyone else. The numbers next to the lines is the enmity position they're in. We don't care about this. The only ones we care about is the red one. Now let's look at the enemy list. Red is good. That means they're hitting you. If you see any other color and you're the tanking, you've made a mistake and we're in trouble. Getting enmity in this game is very simple. In dungeons, you put your tank stance on and leave it on. That's it. So long as you're hitting the mobs or the boss, it is quite literally impossible for you to lose aggro. In 24-person and 8-person content, it's a tiny bit more complicated. If you're the tank who wants to get punched in the face, commonly referred to as the main tank, you turn your tank stance on, leave it on. However, if you die, do not try to re-grab aggro, unless the other tank is asleep and not doing their job. The reason being is that this prevents the boss from spinning around and a aggro battle from happening. This is the clearest sign of poor tanking. Speaking of aggro battles, if the other tank really wants to be the one being punched in the face and turns on their tank stance and tries to rip aggro, just let them. If you're the tank not tanking, commonly referred to as coward or off tank, then leave your tank stance off. If you want to get a little bit fancy and be a little proactive, what you should do is after a few seconds into the fight, you turn your tank stance on to get yourself in the yellow or second place on the enmity list, and then just turning it off again. This is just in case the other tank dies and ensures the boss will immediately target you instead of going to spank that poor black mage booty on the other side of the arena. There are no tank swaps in normal content, so one tank will be tanking the entire time. Which moves us into pulling mobs. In level 51 and above, dungeons are designed to be pulled wall to wall, and you really should be pulling wall to wall. If you're running roulettes with complete strangers, they expect you to go through the dungeon as fast as possible. However, if this is your first time in a dungeon, or you're just not comfortable, do not feel ashamed to pull less. Pull at minimum 2 packs of mobs, learn where they spawn and how hard they hit. Rather slightly slower than dead. Below level 50 content, each dungeon has to be pulled differently according to the group you have. Generally, it's always safe to pull at least 2 groups of mobs. Now that you know how to pull ahead, let's talk about where to stand. Positioning enemies. Quick version, stand in the good, don't stand in the bad. Position the boss or mobs to face away from the group and keep their movements to a minimum. That's it. Do note that sometimes you'll get ranged mobs. What you should do with these is pull slightly past where you want the mobs to actually stand, then pull back into the ranged mobs so that you can clump all of them up nicely together for your party to AoE down. As for bosses, nearly all dungeon bosses and normal content bosses will position themselves for mechanics, but for those that do not, you should either move them to the center of the arena facing north, or just tank them where they are facing away from the group. As for standing in the good, these are healing bubbles that your friendly healer has placed, stand in them. These are damage bubbles that your DPS friends have placed. Put the bads in them. These are called no-no zones. Don't stand in them. As a side note, blue AoEs from NPCs are good. Stand in them. Combos, attacks. Keep pressing buttons. Seriously, if your GCDs aren't cycling, you're doing something wrong. Remember to read your tooltips and try to maintain your combos if possible. Doing a 100% perfect rotation isn't expected of you in this content, but it's always something you can strive towards when you're more comfortable in your role. So long as your GCDs are rolling and you're trying to keep your off GCD offensive abilities on cooldown, you're doing okay. Now for the most important but often overlooked part of tanking. Defenses. Use your defenses. In dungeons, there's no real set way to use your cooldowns and is very much preference. I'd advise large cooldowns when you stop your pulls coupled with a short cooldown. Then move your way towards weaker cooldowns as you kill the mobs, reusing your shorter cooldowns when they're available to maximize your beefiness. When most of the enemies are dead and you're just listening to the sweet last dying gasps of the last few mobs, save your cooldowns for the next group. Defenses are also far more important in large mob pools than in the boss. A large group of mobs will hit way harder than any dungeon boss could. You should still be using your cooldowns or tank busters, as well as your defenses when you think there's a lot of auto attacks coming. I'd also highly advise getting into the habit of using reprisal on tank busters, as well as reprisal and your party defensive ability on AoEs. Even though these aren't even close to necessary or needed in this content, it's just a very good habit to start building if and when you decide to do harder content. A few examples of how you can have a small defensive rotation are shown on the screen. None of these are definitive. Change them and use them as you feel comfortable and for what group you're in. Do not forget that arm's length is a good defensive cooldown during mob pulls. You'll slow the attack by 20%, so you get hit 20% less. Pretty good. Also, don't freak out if your HP gets really low. So long as you've been using your defensive cooldowns, are dodging the AoEs, you're doing your job, and it's most likely that either the healer is pushing out as much damage as they can before shooting your HP back up, or they fell asleep. Now, there's no real way to know what attack is going to do what outside of looking it up beforehand, but this is never required and quite frankly might ruin the fun of doing something for the first time. Luckily, the bosses in this content will generally do most of their attacks alone at first, or have some gigantic tail that'll make it quite obvious what is going to be happening. So what you should do is read the name of the attack, see what it does, and make sure you keep this association for when it happens later in the fight, as later into the fight the boss will start pairing mechanics up and doing multiple things at the same time. Here's a general rule of thumb for attack names. Does it sound really scary? Is there no markers in the fight anywhere? It's probably a room-wide AoE or a tank buster. All other attacks will have orange no-no zones or markers of some kind. A final note on cooldowns in 8-person content. You have a button that can add defenses to your co-tank. Use it! Not only does it make the healer's life easier and costs you literally nothing, you'll be loved and adored by all who notice it. And that's it. When you're doing a fight for the first time, you'll catch on what the tank buster is very quickly when a huge chunk of your health disappears. Congratulations! You've completed your course in basic tanking. Do these things and you'll be a competent tank that blends perfectly into mediocrity such as myself. To improve from here, you should look up some guides for your specific job to optimize your rotation and opener, and you'll be ready to be crushed by some more difficult content. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and have a good day, my friends.